share what I've learned. So I've got about 25 years of experience. I've worked in automotive for about 10 years and worked in connected car and tying predictive systems, which is now becoming autonomous vehicles, in the early stages of satellite radio and some other initiatives in automotive. I worked for Raytheon and worked with DARPA a lot on mobile ad hoc networks. I've always been in these places of building entrepreneurial activities and or initiatives within larger organizations. And then I worked at Dow AgroSciences doing plant genetics and bringing big data in to do machine learning over big data sets with plant genetics for prediction. And I've done some things with healthcare, and I had my own startup for a while, and I grew that out and sold it. I worked with Chris Atkinson here in the back at SEP, so we've done consulting together. So a little bit of 25 years of a mix of a lot of different things, and so I have kind of he's smiling because I have this unique perspective that I bring to the table with all these weird experiences in my 25 years. So let's walk through that. So has anybody ever heard of psychometric measurement? No one? Seriously, no one? Why are you in here? Just intriguing. I sold it well, I guess. So psychometrics, basically all it is mind measurement, psychometric, right? So, but what I'm going to talk about is really what we're trying to do is take what's not measurable and a person's perceived reality and try to make it measurable. In a predictive system, I'm just going to identify what I meant for this talk. It's a system that intuitively aligns a person's ideal perceived reality with a desired outcome. Kind of have some definitions out of the way here. So today, when you build a predictive system, a lot of times you start with a hunch, and then you gather some data. This is what I've heard all day long today, like in these different talks. This is what. So I feel pretty good about this little wheel. You start with a hunch, you gather some data, you do some data science magic, and then you prototype your findings, and then you build a product. I know it's a lot more involved than that, and there's some real science behind it, but really at the core, it's kind of like that. And we get to kind of an ideal predictive reality. So what I'm proposing is, what I've learned over the last 6 months and what I'm proposing today is, now this is going to sound like I work for marketing and sales, and I'm wearing a jacket, so I kind of look like I'm working for marketing and sales, so just bear with me. We'll identify your ideal customer, or your ICP, your ideal customer profile. You define their needs through like jobs to be done framework and outcomes. You interview and identify the themes that you have the hunch for with these, and you apply scales and quantify. This is where these little things here are my attempt to show where psychometrics can come into play. So you apply a scale and you quantify their ideal reality, and then we launch predictive nuggets and we test it. This can go very quickly. It doesn't, and it can be agile and iterative. It does not have to sound as long as or it doesn't have to be as long as it sounds. So has anybody ever worked with on a new product where you worked with a marketing team that helps you identify an ideal customer profile? One person. All right. All it really is what you're trying to do is, instead of building some predictive nugget or a new product for the world, you really talk about who are we going to target first, who's going to pay us for this thing we're going to build, or who am I going to trigger this response for, ideally. So what you're trying to do is really understand that space first, look at the people and some attributes about that first. And the reason you do that is, with the takeaway down there, you only have so much time and money and resources. You want to make sure that you're targeting someone that's going to find appreciation in it when you deliver that predictive nugget. So the core attributes, the Edison Fund is one of our venture capital partners at Amplify. They're a $1 billion fund. They have a framework for defining your ICP, and they use some terms that a lot of others don't, like firmographics and all that. I kind of left some of that stuff off. But firmographic is really, if you're building a product for an organization, really understand what's inside the walls of the firm or the organization. But psychographics are what you're kind of familiar with, right? Values, attributes, beliefs, and it really gets at who are they. The demographic is what population are they, gender, race, income, education. Technographic is If you're going after people that are heavy phone users, are they really using Instagram or Twitter, or are they really inside of a more legacy type desktop environment, Windows users, things like that? Kind of have to consider that when you build some of this stuff. So, in behavioral, how do they act? So that's what, you take all of those attributes and you put those together and you get an ICP. So I'm going to use this lukewarm example. I tried for weeks to get this to come out well, but we're going to do it today together, and it's going to be what it is. So we're going to look at buying an SUV or a van, because it's really hard to do this in about 35-40 minutes. It's very complex, and if I go too far, it's not really comprehensible, so I'm trying to do it a very simple way. So if you look at it, if we're talking about a van or an SUV, and I'm an auto manufacturer or a dealership, I may define what my core ideal customer profile. So psychographics would be family-oriented, suburban lifestyle, safety-conscious, active travelers. Demographic might be parents and guardians within a certain age range, a household income, those kinds of attributes. Busy lifestyle, kids, activity, like to take a trip. And then for the infotainment or the technographic information, you might say they're phone users, that you like to use Google Maps, they text some, they do some social media, and then streaming audio. Now, we might look at adjacent ICPs just to make sure we're not overlooking someone. So a new market might be someone that's more of a community-focused, newly married, highly community-focused, hands-on, do-it-yourself, or early career, 0 kids, but they need the space to haul things. They don't want to have a pickup truck, that kind of thing. And then you might have the empty nester that has, these are their children, and they have grandchildren, and they also have. So you can kind of see how that works, and you can kind of tell if we're going to build something, now we can start to narrow it. And we may start here with our testing space. Because if I ask everyone or I ask the whole world, I'll never get done. I'm trying to boil the ocean. So you may be thinking, okay, why am I at a big data conference and we're talking about marketing, and why do I need all this? It feels heavy, and we haven't even started talking about data science or anything else yet. So just hang on. Like I said a minute ago, if you just take a look at some of these, it's really activity. It aligns everybody on the thing you're trying to build, and it gets you more narrow focus so you can do some additional research. So we'll keep digging. There's some gold down there. See, it's a different kind of presentation. I told you. I warned you from the get-go. All right, so we've talked about ICP. Let's talk about, has anybody ever heard of jobs to be done? I know you guys have. Okay, has anybody ever applied it? Like tried to really apply it to build a product? Has anybody done requirements analysis? Okay, it reminds me very similar of, but you're really trying to get at the core thing that people will pay you for. And I'll give you an example in a minute. Have you ever heard of Clayton Christensen or Tony Olick? It's funny because this guy's super famous. This guy's not. These two founded the idea basically hand in hand together back in 1998, and he actually put it in place and implements it and runs a company building this kind of stuff. So he must have marketed himself really well. That's all I can say. But there's some things that they're kind of famous for saying. So people don't buy products, they hire the product to make progress in a specific circumstance, to get a job done. What appears to be random, this is where he comes in. What appears to be random and innovation can actually be mapped and clearly identified. The core unmet needs of a customer can form predictive solution ideas. So those are intriguing statements, but they're hard to do in real practice. So when I say I'm going to manufacture that product right there, what's the first thing you would say that product would do? What would you do with that? And my goal as a company is to help people prepare hot beverages. What does that thing do? Anyone?
Well,
exactly. That's what people would say, right? They would say it boils hot water. Remember, I want to build hot beverages. I want to let you make hot beverages, right? So you may be, how many people are tea drinkers versus coffee drinkers? So tea drinkers, how many coffee drinkers? Yeah, exactly. So you were probably thinking, okay, hot beverage, hot chocolate, coffee, tea, right? All the tea drinkers thought this. Well, you can't really make tea, which is that. You're going to have some other paraphernalia, right? And if you're a coffee drinker, like, see, you can tell I'm a coffee drinker because I put like all these crazy things in. French press, instant, pour over, right? And that's where my mind went, right? And through interviews, you might find out that you need all of these things. It goes back to the analogy of, have you ever heard the thing where I want to drill a 1/4-inch hole? I don't really want to buy a drill and a drill bit, although I do because I'm kind of a handy guy and I like tools. But at the end of the day, I need to drill a 1/4-inch hole, not buy a drill and a drill bit. Now, if you're Keurig, you might attack this problem completely different. Here I am building something from, I don't know when the tea kettle came out or when that thing came. It's been around for a long time. They went at it from a different, they knew the job to be done, and they simplified the whole process, and they solved it for everybody, right? And they've been pretty popular. You see these around. So how do you do that? Well, this is, Chris, have you ever seen this?
Mm-mm.
Yeah, so I've stumbled onto this in I know Chris has done a lot of jobs to be done work. This is something that Tony's Strategian has developed, and it helps you with, if you've done requirements analysis like you said you've done, that can be exhausting and you never know when it's done, and it's days of life you never get back. Really, honestly, if you look back in your career, that's what it is, because it may or may not get used. But if you let's take the example of buying a van or an SUV. If you do that, when you first go to buy a vehicle for your family, you're going to define it, right? So you take this and you think about who it is. It's me buying the SUV right here, and so it's me buying an SUV. The first step is defining it. The outcome is you start to define at the definition stage, you start to put some outcomes that would happen in the definition. I would create a list of things around features I would want on the van. And then I might start to locate. So then I would start to see, well, where can I buy these vans? What dealerships? Would I go to Craigslist or a dealership? Or would I use other sources like cars.com? So then I begin to prepare, and maybe it's a bad experience, and then I confirm it. So I'll prepare and I'll look around, I'll see what my other options are, and I'll prepare like whether I'm going to do visits or what my steps are, and then I'll confirm. So I'll start to put feelers out and talk to different dealerships. I'll execute, and I may actually go visit a dealership and drive a vehicle. So what it does is it gives you this framework to try to understand the full journey, a repeatable journey for people in every walk of defining jobs to be done or the outcome or need that they're trying to achieve. Does that make sense? All right. So now we've spent, if you think about those two steps, you're probably thinking, well, that doesn't feel very agile. Is anybody on an agile team like you're building? Yeah. So, and if you're not, it'll be the trendy thing next year, and you will be. And so, if you're on an agile team, you've been taught to just define it, build it, iterate on it, right? You'll figure it out eventually. So if you can imagine, if you really had an ideal customer profile, you can kind of narrow down some of that. How do you do your sprint planning? If you have a need and an outcome, now you have a goal for the thing you're trying to build, right? So your workload, instead of going into a room and whiteboarding and sitting down with a triad of product owner, usability, or UX person and a bunch of engineers and hoping you build the right thing, or talking to your customer and having an ideation workshop and doing that, now you've kind of got some scope around what you're trying to do. You spent some time with your customer before you're ready to build by understanding their job needs, and you knew what customers really were because you defined their ideal profile, and now you can start to build and iterate. So we're getting there. There's the gold's actually moving and we're not digging a bigger hole. I didn't know how to do that on another graphic card. So. I never caught that until I showed it just now. Anyway, it's a groundswell. Gold's just coming up everywhere. So now we have the ICP, we define their needs, and now we're going to talk about, we're going to start to get where I kind of unlock through the psychometrics we do at Amplify, how you can apply that in this whole design and product building exercise. So how do we define or find a human's reality? Does anybody remember the movie Matrix? Okay, good. So first we do research. Has anybody ever worked with a user experience, heavy in a user experience group? Yeah, so a lot of times you do research questions, but really what happens is the UX person will just come to you with what they found with those questions, right? The results a lot of times. What you really should do is think about your ICP group. Find a narrow group. Well, I'm talking maybe 10 to 40 people that represent your ICP. Spend some time with them. Talk to them about the focus. Well, first off, focus on listen for the psychometric attributes. When they say things like the intangibles, like image or I feel, or the things you can't measure that aren't really obvious. It's not the thing how I'm using it. It's how it makes them feel. It's how they perceive other people watching them use it. Things like that. That's just scratching the surface. And then you take a look at that and you form a hypothesis, like what you want to interview around. So you have your jobs to be done statement. You focus on 10 to 40 people, and then you really start to have interview questions and write down everything they say or record everything they say and then turn that into a transcript. And you'll start to hear things like when I'm does anybody watch the Jeep commercials, or does anybody own a Jeep? Let me ask that question. No one in this room owns a Jeep. Has anyone ever ridden a Jeep? Okay. All right, good. Wow. Have you ever noticed how people wave at you when you own a Jeep or ride in a Jeep? Like, it's on the commercials now, but that's like a real. I had a Jeep for a while. I have lots of friends that have Jeeps. That's a cultural thing. I don't know. I don't even know where it came from, but it's been around for a long time. And so I have a Dodge Challenger because I'm kind of a gearhead, and all I get is some goof at the stoplight wanting to race me. Like that's my experience. And so that is part of. Do I admire that kind of brand culture? Do I want to be in that Jeep family? Right? Do I want to be waved at every time I'm driving my Jeep around? Do I feel cooler in a van versus an SUV? Let me ask that question. Does anybody own a van? I own a van. All right. Do you feel cool in your van? All right. Chrysler really tried to push that, right? They have like the talking van that makes the SUV guy feel like he's driving a station wagon. Has anybody seen that commercial? It's out there, trust me. Or do I just don't care if I look cool because it's really just a utilitarian thing that I have to get done, right? You'll start to hear stuff like that when you talk to your customer. But if you talk to too many people, you'll get lost in the woods of all these answers, right? And then you're back to square one and you really haven't gotten anywhere. That's why the ICP is very important. So, through the interviews, when you combine that with jobs to be done statements, you'll start to derive meaning. And how do we do that and actually start to apply some statistical processes so we can measure it and scale it out? So what you do, I've been working with a professor at Rollins College, and he taught me through all this. So I am not a PhD in any of this. I've just been applying it like I have with everything in my career and just learning as we go and building. But I spent a lot of time with him over the last 6 months really figuring out how he does this because he specializes in psychometrics. And what he does is he'll interview the ICP, he'll listen and take the transcripts, and then they create a code book. Has anybody ever done anything like this? Like created a code book from transcripts? So all that really means is inside of there you'll start to see words that represent meaning, and so you tag those words to meaning, and that becomes your code book. So that way when you scale it out and you can ask detailed questions, have you bought a new vehicle and done a survey at the end when they've asked you what your dealership experience was and it's on a Likert scale? Mm-hmm. Think about why they're doing that. Someone spent time and they want to know what the meaning is inside of your head of what that experience is like. Think about all the variables that go into buying a car and how that meaning is important to them because that's what keeps them around and why you are a return customer. And how to measure meaning. How do you do that? How do you measure what a dealership experience is to every one of you? Because it's going to be different to every one of you. And so you do that, you code it, and then you use something called content thematic analysis. And that's just a fancy way of saying you tag a bunch of things and you start to look for themes and you form a hypothesis around those themes. And then, from there, we'll start to apply a quantifying scale to it and measure it. So in our world at Amplify, what we do is we give you yes?
So, can you go to the previous slide, please?
I can try. That one?
So the content thematic analysis, is it like a procedure kind of a thing?
It is. It's yeah, we could talk about it afterward, but really what it really does is it's looking for themes and coding them inside of your transcript. So imagine you've got all of these interviews you've done with 40 different people and you recorded everything. And so now you can go through and start to circle phrases that are identifying psychometric values, and then you create a code book and map that on the outside. So now we can start to form a hypothesis around the meaning trends that we're seeing in the themes, and now we're going to scale that out with a Likert scale or some type of measurable scale and do a broader research survey. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I have one simple question. Like, is it done on a sample that is like 50 members or 100 members?
Right. Yes. It's a subset representing your ideal customer profile and centered around the jobs to be done. Does that make sense? Okay. And they're done, and the transcripts are created with real interviews. So I would sit down with you and I would ask you a bunch of questions and I would record what you say and I'd look at all those words and phrases and try to find meaning in it. And then I'd create the code book through thematic analysis. And so now we're going to shift from qualitative to quantitative. So you use your ICP candidates and implement a sampling strategy. Now, instead of sending out a generic survey to everyone, you're going to look at your ICP and scale that out and really focus in on quantifiable questions that you found meaning in. There's indicators or variables in there that you want to dig deeper with and measure it. So now it's not just some fluffy thing in your head, it's something you can quantify and start to build things that actually trigger prediction. So we're going to leverage your smaller interviews and apply your themes through the content thematic analysis study. Use themes to quantify the variables and apply them at scale. And then survey your ICP groups at scale using the variable statements. And has anybody ever used exploratory factor analysis at all? It's kind of like clustering. Like, think about clustering algorithms. That's what it always reminds me of. I'll show you a picture of what it looks like. In the psychology and psychometric world, it's one of the main tools they use. Whoops. Sorry, I went too fast. So, in the van example, we could start to see, like, if I came up, this is where my example gets a little fuzzy, to try to really roll this up. So, because normally you would have dozens of variables that you're trying to find whether they load into a latent variable. So you have a vehicle selection experience. Remember, we're trying to figure out whether we're buying a van or an SUV. And through some real studies we've done, through our scaled variable study that we found through our early interviews, we've sent out surveys with scales of strongly agree or strongly disagree, those kinds of scales. Now, we start to see that image is very important. The feeling of roominess inside of the vehicle is also a very impactful variable. And then the versatility of the vehicle is very important to people. And that rolls up or loads back into the vehicle selection experience. So we found our themes, we scaled out our statements through a scale, just like you've taken with surveys. And now we're looking at how it loads so we can roll this up. Remember, it's a very complex space trying to measure someone's ideal reality. You have a lot of variables. You have to see how they load. You want to see how they, so you can understand it. You're going to try to create some type of prediction around vehicle selection experience. This is what I mean. Doesn't that look like a clustering algorithm? Yeah, so that's exploratory factor analysis. And this is a 101 course, so no questions from the back. No, I'm just kidding. What we're doing here is we are not applying theory. We are not having a rationale. We're just looking at how variables cluster from our scaled surveys. So Are you following me with the whole scaled survey thing? Is it just afternoon? We're starting to hit the afternoon a little bit. Okay. All right, nobody fall off the chair. We'll keep pushing. We only got like 20 minutes and we're out of here. So then, if we take those surveys, and you start to look at the variables that you've coded through your code book, in those surveys, remember you created those surveys to dig into the meaning that you found through your interview sessions. Now you're scaling this out to hundreds or thousands of people to see if there's any scientific or statistical significance to the variable and the hypothesis that you've formed. So around that, now we're looking for clusters to see how things load into latent variables. And we'll see 3 latent variables here in a minute, and I'll show you what I'm talking about. Let's see, I think I covered everything on there. And at the end of the day, we're going to apply our scientific human logic to these clusters to see how we can analyze that data to see what the significance is and label the variables. So we're just trying to roll it up and simplify this complex space into something we can understand and comprehend. So let's look at that example again. So now, can I prove my hypothesis by finding statements that load into latent variables? So the latent variable would be like image. Can I run that exploratory factor analysis and start to see how likely these things are to load into that latent variable? So now I start to look at, one of the statements was really looking at how the cool factor, or how image is impacted. How do I feel cooler in an SUV versus a van? And remember, you might have like 6 statements, so it might be questions around how you feel in a van versus how you feel in an SUV, and you're trying to compare and contrast those. You'll have questions around feeling the feeling of being roomy inside of the vehicle. Do you know what I mean by being roomy? Like if you've been in an SUV with 4 kids, like it's really tight, versus a van, there's always that room in the middle, and yeah. And how does that load into a latent variable called image? Or the versatility of it. Does it really matter? Is that really part of my image when I have that vehicle? How I feel and perceive myself driving that vehicle. You may find, and some statistical purists don't like one thing loading into another thing, but sometimes it just happens. So you may, and think about in this case why the number of children in your household would impact potentially which one. If you have 5 kids, you may just rule out an SUV, right? And then these 2 would load into another variable here, and I'll show you the map in just a second. If socioeconomic group and what's the highest level of education, because that may impact which one you want to. It may also be an indicator of price range or value of the vehicle. Okay, so now if we take a look at what's that mod, has anyone ever, I turned it on side because everybody shows it like this. I think that's a later. Has anybody ever seen this? Where you have an outcome variable, a latent trait, indicators, and statements loading. Has anybody ever seen that model? Okay. So that's what we're applying here overall. So now, if we're going to create a score around how likely someone is to buy a van versus an SUV, so a range, like van would be here, SUV would be here, and we're trying to create some indication. These latent variables are loaded by these indicators, which are loaded by the survey statements. So if we think about that, we are able to explain that the feeling of ownership and how it's comprised of image and coolness, right? The feeling of how I feel driving each vehicle, the roominess and versatility is part of the vehicle selection experience latent variable. And you can label these. These are really how you control and how you understand the data and how you can explain it. The number of children definitely impacts family size, which is part of the score. Education and socioeconomic go into household demographics and drive that score. So now you can see you've taken this very complex survey, rolled it down into some indicators, and put it into some latent variables, which are very simplified, and into a score overall. Now you can start to do something with that. So now we can create a little nugget of prediction. Again, I'm not an artist, that's what I can do with Google Images. So now if we have an SUV versus a van, and then we take this job wheel that we had earlier, the job map, the journey, you can start to think about I just put some options down here about what opportunities can be. So if I know how you feel and what your perception is when you're going to buy a van versus an SUV, and I can get you on the website and fill out a survey, just really quickly, a very lightweight survey for that ICP, so I know who I'm targeting, why I built that van, and who I think I could sell 80% of them to. Now, 5-6 questions, I can kind of start to target who I'm going to predict. So I could actually create a much more accurate vehicle selector on my website, and then start to filter in and eliminate vehicles that I'm showing you really quickly. Because I've done my homework, I know what your needs and jobs are, so within 3 or 4 questions, I can get to your image, your utilitarian factor, like what you're using it for, and then I can look at your demographics really quickly if you're willing to share those, and then narrow right in on something that I think that you're interested in. And then once I learn that, what you looked at, let's say you go to the dealership and you want to see a vehicle, so you contact me, I'm a salesman, and you say, okay, I found this vehicle on the website. I can dig a little deeper, and I could even send you even some follow-on questions or be on the phone and be prepared to drill into some certain areas with you. And now when you show up, I may actually have 2 other vehicles sitting there that are more likely for you to buy. So now you've impacted this predictive, you've impacted the full chain of the buying experience. So when you're looking and defining, I interact with you, right? When you're trying to locate it and investigate. When you come to confirm and you're going to drive this thing, now I impacted you again with prediction, right? And you're thinking about it from a job wheel standpoint. Any questions, or is that making sense? I'm probably going pretty quick here, so we're going to wrap up a little early. So, who works on predictive type products in here? Anybody in the room? Okay. Can you give just a quick example of what you're building?
Sure. So this is, I used to work in the finance background. I work with the state. So they wanted to build dynamic boxes on the front end where based on the gender, based on the region they're coming from, based on a few other attributes, they wanted to trigger activities which can make customer engagement more.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Like it's more like a more experienced feeling. A customer comes onto the site and he is looking for credit cards. So they have, if that specific financial institution has 5 credit cards, what would be more engaging to the customer and
so very similar to the van buying experience that we're talking about, really.
But
yeah.
But the main solution people could not solve is when they are creating these activity packages. So Adobe Suite has multiple tools.
Right.
So in that they have a specific tool called Adobe Target. That is where we automate the bot saying, hey, take these attributes, and based on the attributes, deliver the experience.
Right.
So there are multiple packages that are being developed. So based on the attributes, different packages trigger, and they deliver the experience. So say,
I'm going to cut you off because I want to stop right there. I want to dig into something that you're talking about for the rest of the room. So if you go back to here, the thing that's different from building software with hardened predictions and what I'm proposing and what I found lately is when you pair the psychometric data and you think about the intangible experience, you should be focusing on this right here. Really gets you the job to be done. The thing that people want to buy your product for. It really doesn't get to the emotional reaction or the intangible attribute of why they're buying your product or why they relate to your brand or how do you get them to relate to your brand. That's all left out. So what you can do is you need to focus on those psychometric values and understand them early on, so then you can follow up with, instead of building a rules engine or a relational model, right, and with a trigger, you follow up with a, hey, I think you're looking for this. Let me ask you a few quick questions. Bam, and then I get that back. And now I hit you right in the face with exactly what you wanted. So we did this at Amplify with we do these 6-minute surveys. It's all the different questions about 17 different factors about working in your workplace, like psychological safety, engagement, all of these different things. And what we used to do is we'd do the survey, and then you'd be done. And you would review later on with your HR or your boss about how things are going to work. What we do now, in the last 3 months, we've turned on real-time qualitative feedback. So we look at your data. I saw your hand. We look at your data, and at the end, we say, hey, these 3 indicators are really low. Why don't we look at that one? Why don't you tell us some real words about what's going on there? And then that qualitative feedback, you tell a comment, and now's your voice. Like, now you can say, well, why did I score psychological safety, which means you don't feel like you can talk to your boss clearly or upper management. And so that goes right into why the driver's low for your organization. Your comments are right there. They're anonymized, but now when your manager sees that, he says, okay, I understand what that driver is. I know that it's low, and this is what my people were saying about it. And they're all saying it, so I better dig into that. We didn't have that before until we really started to look at the psychometric attributes. Before, we would do these smart pulses where we'd send out a follow-on survey, and it had to be initiated by one of our strategists, and it was just, we get about 20% of the response rate. We get 98% response rate now to those qualitative questions because we poked at your driver and asked you a question right in real time because we're really trying to dig at that.
What is the effective way of the survey? Is it through interviews or is it through e-delivery?
There's a couple different attributes to it. You start with interviews because you really want to do that in-depth, like personal surveys with your targeted. Well, actually, you're going to my last slide. I'll just go there and we can open it up for questions because really, I'm beating a dead horse a little bit now because I'm really at the end of it. I think you all get it. So you start with your customer, you identify who they are, you describe their core needs, and then you ask them if you're right. This is when you sit down at the table with them, and you do it through your target, you interview the people that you really feel like they're going to buy your product. And you find out they may not want to buy your products, and then you may have to do it again, right, with a different ICP. But when you do that and you talk about the jobs, you'll really start to hear from them why they're buying it, why they need to drill the 1/4-inch hole, right, that kind of thing. And then you'll get into scaling that out. So you do the surveys again, but it's not so detailed. Now you've got themes, you've found themes in that, and you're applying it at scale, and you have a hypothesis that you're going to try to find through exploratory factor analysis. You scale that out, you do a bunch of variable testing through a Likert scale and a survey, and now you see if you can find quantifiable statements that can roll up to latent variables that you can create a model of prediction around to get them really intrigued in your product. That's basically the flow of what I've rambled on about for 30 minutes now. And I think with that, that's pretty much it. All I was going to say on this other slide was basically recap a little bit. But the other thing I'd like to say, there are other things. Chris does a really good talk on gaming theory. And so when you look at gaming theory, you're kind of playing around with psychometrics a little bit. You're really trying to get into the head of engagement, but going at it from a repeatable process in your product. So that's also very powerful. If you, we totally should tag up and do a gaming theory and psychometrics thing because I think that would be a really powerful talk. And then you can leverage machine learning. You can leverage if statements. You don't have to have AI. And I know I probably shouldn't say this in an innovation big data track, but sometimes some good old if statements get the job done. And we were talking about this earlier, right? And a rules engine, right? I've done a lot of stuff in automotive with rules engines and if statements, and you would have thought it was fancy AI in the back end, right? And it's probably in your cars out there right now. So I probably won't get asked back next year. Next time. Just real quick, like this is, you can look this guy up, Joshua Hammonds. He's the guy that taught me about psychometrics. Really, really super guy. And I want to give credit to these guys because they're pioneers of how to break down product that people actually want to buy. And then, yeah, that guy over there. And then these are links that when I put it out digitally, I have to. So, any more questions? You had a question earlier.
So
now take it easy. Like, I'm not going to be a data scientist up here. I'm going to try my best, but yeah.
So how different is this model from a classifier model?
The exploratory factor analysis?
The entire process, right from getting the psychometrics to the end when you showed the whole chart.
Yeah.
So how different is it from a normal classifier naive-based, suppose?
When you're training a classifying model, the only difference, I would say that a classifying model could be applied to the system more at the system level, right? And so along those, when you go back to in these two star points, a classifying model might be more subset of that as opposed to the full journey. But you would use psychometrics or the results, the themes that you found, and the variables you're going to trigger off of in training that model. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
The full journey might be impacted with real user feedback, with short snippets of psychometrics along the way, but that might just be another input to a inline classifying model.
So even in the feedback curve, I mean, I'm just suggesting that there could be a, like when few customers take surveys, they give like sentiments as well.
Yep.
So that could also go back into the model and
Yep.
help in the future.
Yep, I totally agree. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just wondering, so yeah, obviously this is like really marketing focused, and that's obviously a clear use case for it, but I'm just curious if you could think of any of other like areas where this kind of analysis might come into play. I'm sure there's probably some interesting,
Well, our world isn't marketing that we're building it for. Like it's finding engagement within an organization. So anytime there's a deeper psychological need that you're trying to discover, it's going to be some product like that. If it's just, you can also use it. So when I worked at Mercedes in Europe for a while, and a lot of their early designs, when they would bring in focus groups and show them around the studio and do those interviews in the
like
studio.
Like the Chevy commercials, right?
Yeah.
The real
Kinda,
people.
Yeah. But they would do that, and we would do reactionary testing to different prototypes, and what you're doing there is a similar thing. It's an interview for building a real product, and then what we would do from that is we would fan that out to a greater ICP profile and get more feedback. And it may have some. Have you ever done these surveys for like Lowe's or Home Depot that are? We have these new product lines. You kind of got to get on these survey things where you get paid to do these kind of surveys that I'm talking about. But they may say like, hey, we're going to carry a DeWalt tool line now, and these are the kinds of tools. Do you have any interest in that, right? What they're really digging at is what kind of people are walking through our doors, and what are their needs? Like, are they buying big drills or little drills, or why are they drilling that 1/4-inch hole? They're really trying to dig at that and understand why do you prefer a Milwaukee over, I don't know why I'm going off on a drill tangent, or over DeWalt or whatever. Does that make sense? Like, you can use it at that level too,
Right.
not just marketing. Yeah. Yeah.
And my question kind of was around, I had a friend who works for this Lowe's or Home Depot where they buy this HVAC system.
Yeah.
So he was doing like some research on, data science on it to say, hey, Seattle, Indianapolis, Chicago, and he was trying to gauge the temperature, and one of the things he suggested was like sometimes when you do that, there is some problem with it, because in California it might go 100 in the afternoon and it might go like 30 in the night. So when you take an average of a temperature, your entire math screws up for that city though, like for a particular city. But it works for another city where the temperatures average would be a good point.
Yep.
Now, going back to this psychology on some of those, some of the data points, there might be more usefulness for psychology, like buying a house, but there might be some where this might not be that useful. Is it an
potentially?
point?
Let me talk about the temperature one, because when I lived in Europe, we didn't have AC, so you didn't have air conditioning. You just sweated at work, which was an experience you have to live there to really appreciate. And so in that world, let's say I'm Train or Ingersoll or somebody that builds HVAC systems, right? In that world, what I may try to understand is in Europe, like people have a greater tolerance. How are you going to measure greater tolerance of being hot at work? That's psychometrics. I mean, that's what you're going to get. I'm okay smelling at work, or I don't care what I smell like at work. Like those are things like I don't know. This was not a way I thought I would get. I'm just on the fly here riffing. But so when you think about that, but in America, we may like to be cold at work. I get sleepy if I'm hot or whatever. Over there, like they prefer to be warm. When they come here, a lot of the German colleagues I had hated it because they were cold all the time, right? They're just cold in the office. And so, and I'm kind of that way now too, I understand it. So why I'm battling on is if you're trained, you may invest in Europe in a different strategy. You don't build AC compressors, you build window automation, right? You open the windows in the afternoon because that's warm enough or cool enough, right? And over there, we don't even build AC units. I don't even market them, right? I don't even have manufacturing that ships to Europe anymore, right? I just go to America or wherever, right? So it does impact your overall strategy. Yeah. Was it something I said?
I have a bust again.
All right. Any more questions? All right. Thank you very much.